Iraq War is one of the most important wars of the 20th century. It may not be as romantic as the First and Second World Wars, but it is a war which is very illustrative both of how modern warfare works in general and of the weaknesses inherent in modern Middle Eastern armies. The war consisted of over 8 years of trench warfare fought between two extremely politicized and incompetent militaries. At the end of the 8 years, neither side had really gained anything, leaving the borders of each completely unchanged and the political leadership not just unchanged but reinforced and solidified in power by the wartime conditions. Of particular note at the time of the release of this video is that the Iran-Iraq War shares many core similarities with the Russia-Ukraine War. The war included prolonged trench battles in which neither side was able to gain substantial territory. The numerically superior side was never really able to push forward the initiative in any real way due to advantages American satellite data gave to the weaker party. The lack of a capable internal arms industry proved very important in the war, and the limitations of the international arms market also proved very important to the conduct of the war and its ultimate outcome. The war was fought between two eccentric authoritarian regimes between 1980 and 1988 over control of the Persian Gulf. These two eccentric regimes are the Khomeiniist Iran and the Ba'athist Iraq. These two states were destined to be diametrically opposed to each other, as the Iranian Khomeiniist government called for an international revolution of all Shia Muslims to establish Islamist states. Ba'athist Iraq was a secular Arab nationalist state where it was controlled by a Sunni minority with a vested interest of preventing a popular revolt led by the Shia majority from coming to power and imposing its military and religious rule upon a Sunni minority. The Khomeiniist Iran was a recent entity when the war began, only having come to power in the previous year during the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Prior to the Islamic Revolution, Iran had been a monarchy under control of the Pahlavi dynasty. The first monarch of the dynasty, Reza Shah, he was Reza Khan, a brigadier general who came to power via coup in 1921 and eventually declared himself the Shah, aka the Emperor of Iran, in 1925. Reza Shah and then his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, ruled the country in a paternalistic manner, discarding the previous liberalism of the constitutional monarchy which preceded them. The dynasty stressed industrial modernization and Iranian nationalism, while proving the West with lucrative investments. Mohammad Reza began to secularize and westernize the country and push back against the traditional elements of Shia Islam by doing things such as banning the veil on women. These vast reforms were called the White Revolution, as they were led by the monarchy. Popular opposition to these reforms led the state to become increasingly authoritarian and ultimately totalitarian, with the establishment of the Savak secret police, which held an omnipresence within Iranian society. The Pahlavi's dynasty took control over their control slowly dissolved in the late 1970s as popular protests began to emerge across society, with a broad coalition of non-monarchists, including Islamists, communists, and liberals, all in opposition to the dynasty. The situation collapsed when the Islamists started the Cinema Rex fire as a false flag terrorist attack on August 19, 1978. Opponents of the regime blamed the dynasty and Savak. The Shah, by that time extremely sick and suffering from cancer, abandoned the country on January 16, 1979 to seek medical treatment abroad. The opposition rapidly took control. Ultimately, Khomeini's Islamists were able to outmaneuver all other factions and establish their Islamist republic. Baathism is an ideology which stresses pan-Europe unity. It's similar to Marxism-Leninism as it advocates for a vanguard party to lead a one-party socialist state. Baathism is a distinctly Arab variant of third positionism. Iraqi Baathists took control in the July 17th revolution in 1968. This was a bloodless coup which placed Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr in charge of the country as president. The coup was the last in a series of conflicts between factions of Iraqi nationalist cliques fighting to establish himself as leaders of the state following the July 14th revolution or coup, which ended the Iraqi monarchy. Al-Bakr, who had been Secretary General of the Ba'athist Party, came to power in this coup and thus became president of the Iraqi Republic. His second in command was his much younger cousin, Saddam Hussein, and he ultimately was appointed vice president and head of the security forces. Al-Bakr's reign from president lasted from 1968 to 1979 and was defined by the consolidation of power by Saddam Hussein as he became the paramount ruler of Iraq. Ultimately, though, on July 16, 1979, Saddam formally became president of Iraq and al-Bakr formally resigned due to supposed health issues, although because he was the cousin of Saddam and Saddam had basically been paramount leader for a prolonged period prior to that, al-Bakr did not get executed or anything like that. Saddam's rule over Iraq was defined by intense personalism rather than any kind of rigorous adherence to the ideology of Baathism. So much so that many tend to refer to this ideology of Iraq during this period as Saddamism rather than Baathism or even Iraqi Baathism. Baathism being a secular ideology which stressed Arab unity as an ethnic group rather than stressing shared religious heritage, ended up being dominated by a faction which was the religious minority in both countries that came to power. So in Syria, as we know, the Alawites took control. In Iraq, it was the Sunni Arabs. As time went on, secularism declined, though, and Baathism took on ideological elements. Baathism in Iraq, I should say, or Saddamism, if you will, took on the ideological elements of Sunni Islamism. Likewise, instead of Pan-Arabism, Iraq began to stress kind of a Neo-Mesopotamianism and a Neo-Babylonianism, glorifying its past before the rise of Christianity and before the rise of Islam. Iraq would invade Iran after relations between the two countries rapidly deteriorated following Iran's Islamic Revolution. But Iraq's reasoning was not simply a bellicose land grab. When the Islamic Revolution occurred, Saddam initially tried to congratulate the new government and had public overtures of friendship towards them. But this was swiftly rebuked by Khomeini, who, once he was firmly in power, began to agitate for Islamist revolution throughout the Middle East, and in particular Shia-majority countries, the one of which bordered Iraq. Iraq, being a Shia-majority nation ruled by the Sunni clique, under the auspices of secularism, was an ideal target as a public enemy and target of agitation for the Iranian government. Iran withdrew its ambassador in early March and then began supporting publicly Shia uprising with Iraq as a matter of policy. In particular, it would support the Islamic Dawa Party, a Shia Islamist revolutionary party. By April 1st, 1980, the Dawa Party, supported by Iran, attempted to assassinate Tariq Azzad, the deputy prime minister and a key ally and supporter of Saddam. In response to this assassination attempt, Saddam executed Mohammed Bakir al-Sar, an ideological leader of the Dawa Party. Iraq also staged an assault on the Iranian embassy and the United Kingdom. Heightened tensions resulting from these events led to hundreds of border incursions of the militaries on both sides. Prior to the Islamic Revolution, Ba'athist Iraq and Pahlavi Iran already had poor relations. The two countries had a long disputed border on the Shet al-Arab River, which marks the border between them, and is at Iraq's most southern point. The Shet al-Arab was incredibly sensitive to Iraq, as it's the only narrow corridor that it has sea access to, which is north of the Shet al-Arab. Iran began to boldly assert its rights to free navigation in the waterway in 1969 under the Pahlavis, and this dispute between the two countries led to Iran supporting a Kurdish rebellion within Iraq, and several border battles between the two countries occurred in 1974 and 1975. Ultimately, Iran was able to intimidate Iraq into giving into Iran's demands for freedom of navigation in the waterway in the 1975 Algiers Accord. Saddam and the Ba'athist leadership considered this a national humiliation for Iraq, which they thought to reverse now that tensions between the two countries were increasing. With Iran supporting rebellion and revolution against the Iraqi leadership, and a long-standing sense of animosity towards Iran with the Ba'athist leadership under Saddam, they chose to preemptively invade Iran. Saddam's war goals are not they're not really continuously identifiable throughout the war. The Iraqi government would often describe the war as a war fought by Iraq on behalf of the greater Arab world to defend them from some kind of Persian expansionism or even colonialism. Iraqi propaganda viewed Iran as the eternal enemy of the Iraqi people, both before and after the Islamization and Arabization of Mesopotamia. Clearly, settling the dispute of the Shat al-Ab waterway in Iraq's favor was a goal of the regime. You could say this is a continuous goal or like a minor goal. I would define wars often as having like minor goals and maximalist goals depending on how the war turns out. And so in this case, the maximalist goal would be incorporation of Khuzestan into Iraq proper, Khuzestan being the Arab majority province which bordered Iraq. As a historian, I find the importance of war goals or war aims. I think, though, even though I just said there's minimal and maximalist goals, is less important. Many, if not most, wars are fought for hazy or an unclear understanding of victory would mean on the part of the aggressor. When examining Saddam's life and his personality, it becomes clear that Saddam often acted in accordance with gut instincts. Well, it should be noted that this was, if anything, beneficial domestically in allowing him to maintain power for as long as he did in Iraq. When it came to the international stage, Saddam made grievous mistake after grievous mistake throughout his entire presidency. The Iran-Iraq war would be the first of these many crushing miscalculations on his part due to playing basically by his gut instincts. The hope of the Iraqi leadership was that the Islamic Revolution's internal chaos would translate into them having a weak military unable to coordinate a defensive of against this external invader, as it happened in the October Revolution in the Soviet Union with their inability to defend against the external invader of the German army during the First World War. Likewise, many minorities began rebelling against the revolution right after it occurred, including ethnic Arabs in the Khuzestan province. The Iraqi leadership helped the Khuzestani Arabs, Kurds, and Alberjanis would aid the Iraqi invasion or may even defect and fight alongside them. September 22nd, 1980, Iraq invaded Iran. The opening attack of the war was a massive Iraqi airstrike coordinated on the Iranian Air Force. Saddam had intended to copy the tactics of Israel in the Six-Day War and the German offensive in the Second World War by destroying the Iranian Air Force on the ground in a surprise, undeclared preemptive invasion. The Iraqi Air Force proved to be comedically incompetent, though, and 5 Iraqi planes were lost to 4 Iranian planes. Iranian air bases were largely unharmed as well. The Iraqi invasion was conducted on a broad front with poor combined arms coordination. While Iraqis had numerical advantage, they proved incompetent at exploiting it. The Iraqi generals and Saddam had assigned numerous targets, but the poorly trained Iraqi military, which was overly politicized in its officer corps, were overwhelmed by these numerous objectives, and it was far too complex for them to carry out. The Iraqi army made extremely minimal gains, about 25,900 kilometers within this broad front. Iraq was able to gain control of the Iranian border town. I suck at this. Khorramshahr, so I think it's Khorramshahr, which had a modern population of which today now has a modern population of some 133,000. The town was only 13 kilometers from the Iraqi border, though. The Iraqi military became bogged down in brutal urban combat and didn't take the city, though, until November 10th, 1980, despite being the city the city only being the first of a planned series of objectives. After taking the city, the Iraqi leadership called off the offensive and took up positions in the short section of land that they captured from Iran by early December of 1980. Of course, Iraq's ultimate dream of Khuzestani Arabs defecting and fighting alongside them never occurred. After the Iraqi advance had stalled, the war bogged down into a stalemate for the next year or so, with Iranians unable to dislodge the meager Iraqi advances into their country. But eventually, through attrition, the Iraqi army was worn down and pushed out of Iranian territory proper. The turning point came in the Iranian Operation Belt Maqabs, or in English, Operation Jerusalem Offensive, in the spring of 1982, where Iran took back Khorramshahr. From this point on until the very end of the war, Iran would have the initiative as it launched multiple offensives into Iraq. Saddam offered white peace, but Iran rejected this proposal, instead demanding regime change and the establishment of Islamic Republic in Iraq. Iran focused its strength on trying to capture Basra, Iraq's large southern port city, and to cut off Iraq's ocean access in the belief that the result would be the collapse of the Ba'athist regime and an ultimate Iranian victory. Iran would build tremendous land defenses in order to defend its borders in depth. The result was there was 6 years of brutal trench warfare in which Iran would repeatedly launch offensives in which they never really gained any real advantage over the Iraqi defenders. Eventually, at one point, Iran did take control of the Al-Faw Peninsula in 1986 and did actually render Iraq a landlocked country. But still, even then, Basra was only under siege and did not fall. With both sides locked into a stalemate on land, the war spread to other fronts as both sides tried to break their stalemate. With Iraq fighting for its life and the Iranian leaders firmly committed to victory despite the extremely heavy cost, the war began to take on a total war-like nature, where each side began to strike non-military civilian targets. This became known as the Battle of Cities, where the Air Force, the artillery, which was in range of the opponent's civilian centers, and rocket forces of each nation struck civilians within cities on both sides. While Iraq was the initial party to attack civilians, Iran retaliated and struck civilians multiple times. As has been seen in general strategic bombardment, civilians in both countries rallied behind their respective nations, and that increased support for the war effort. In the Persian Gulf, each side tried to use its navy and air force to cut off the maritime trade of its rival. In particular, each nation whose primary export was oil. In particular, we should say that each nation had a primary export of oil, in which each depended upon to trade its oil in order to support the war effort for its continued existence. While Iraq could not send tankers through the Iranian blockade of Basra, they could redirect their oil to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia for them, which made Kuwaiti and Saudi frigates tempting targets for Iran. The mountainous northern front between Iran and Iraq was not a place where conventional conflict between the two standing armies was going to go anywhere because of the natural defensive positions that they held, especially in this type of trench warfare. So the battle there was limited because the reluctance of the attacker to give the defender the great advantage they had in that type of terrain. Instead, each side funded Kurdish rebels against the other. Iran's Kurds could be placated, though, and proved little threat to them. Iraq's Kurdish rebels, on the other hand, proved to be a major threat, and as such, Iraqi Kurdistan proved to be a major front within the war, to which Iranians had an advantage. By 1983, both of the major Kurdish Peshmergas, or militias, the KDP and the PUK, were in a large-scale campaign against the central Iraqi government. Iran was able to provide logistic as well as occasional air support to these Kurdish militias. While the Kurds are never able to gain control of Kurdistan and expel the Iraqi central government, they did ultimately tie down a large portion of the Iraqi military. In February of 1988, the Iraqi government began its full-scale crackdown to the Kurdish rebellion, known as the Anfal campaign. The campaign was conducted by having Kurds collaborating with Iraqi forces reveal the Kurdish positions and their accompanying villages. Many of these collaborators would be captured Peshmerga fighters with government forces, telling them that they would be allowed to live if they revealed the Peshmerga's positions. If not, they would be killed. The villages would be destroyed, with both fighters and civilians subjected to firing squads, along with women and children being deported to concentration camps, while the majority of men were killed. Many Kurds would be driven into Turkey as refugees, but Iraqi forces were able to intercept them. If Iraqi forces were able to intercept them, then their men would be massacred. The government would attack the Kurdish civilians, including towns, with aerial bombardment, and most infamously and brutally with chemical weapons. The most famous use of chemical weapons was on March 16, 1988, during the attack on the town of Halabujah. The Iraqi Air Force dropped chemical munitions on the town, including mustard gas and possibly nerve gas. Thousands were killed and permanently disabled. The Halabujah, I suck at that, I'm sorry, and it's sad because this is a really terrible thing that happened. So, Halabujah massacre is the largest known use of chemical weapons against civilians in human history. Tens of thousands of Kurdish civilians would be killed during the Anfal campaign, which ended in September of 1988 after the wider Iran-Iraq war ended on August 20th. Iraq, who was facing the onslaught of the Iranian army, had turned to the use of chemical weapons to defend itself. Iraq used chemical weapons in small quantities starting in 1981, but the first large-scale use of chemical weapons against Iran occurred during the Battle of the Marches, when Iran seemed to have broken through the lakes north of Basra and would be capable of encircling and putting the city to siege. To stop the Iranian advance, Iraq attacked Iranians stationed on Maju Island in one of the lakes with chemical weapons. From that point on, Iraq used chemical weapons liberally throughout the war, the most powerful of which it used were Taban, sarin, and mustard gas. Iraq used them on both conventional Iranian forces and unconventional Kurdish forces and civilians. Iran attempted to use tear gas once, but the religious leadership had serious qualms about any use of chemical weapons, even if they're non-lethal, and did not use them in a real large quantity. The reluctance to use chemical weapons would put Iran at a distinct disadvantage towards Iraq during the war. During this period, chemical weapons were not the only weapons of mass destruction that Iraq had pursued in developing. Iraq also sought to develop nuclear weapons. France had helped Iraq in the creation of the Ozrak reactor in, I'm sorry I'm going to mispronounce this, Tiawatha nuclear center in central Iraq. Fearing that Iraq could develop its own nuclear weapons with the knowledge gained from a working reactor, Israel destroyed the reactor in an airstrike with some Iranian cooperation. This permanently set back Iraq's nuclear program. Since then, no Middle Eastern state has attempted to develop nuclear weapons to directly challenge Israel, as they fear that Israel would get away with an unprovoked attack to destroy the nuclear program, as has recently happened in the 12-day war between Israel and Iran. After the attack, actually following the infamous Iran-Contra scandal, Baathists and Sunnis would believe that the United States, Iran, and Israel were in a secret alliance to keep Iraq down. Before this, Baathist Iraq had been a key Arab power who did not support recognition of Israel. Now, Iraq did not just not support recognition of Israel, but it acted under the headspace that it was in a constant war with Israel. The Iraqi government under Saddam's direction would then prove to be a key supporter of Palestinian causes. In particular, this support for Palestinians in the second I always suck at mispronouncing this. The second Intifada, I always can't pronounce it. Infidata would ultimately be one of the main reasons why the United States invaded it in 2003. Following the Islamic Revolution, Iran found itself an international pariah. It was no longer an ally of the West or of Israel, and it was still an enemy of communist powers such as the Soviet Union and China. It also antagonized the entire Middle East and the Muslim world with its support for radical Islamist revolution and its criticism of other Arab and Middle Eastern regimes. Iran, which had only a minor native arms industry, was dependent on the United States and other Western nations before the revolution for its arms. Now it was without a means to rearm itself since its pre-war stockpile became depleted, I should say, within the war. While Iran pursued regime change in Iraq and had the initiative for the majority of the war, it only did so at immense cost to its own manpower supplies and its own military supplies. At the onset of the war, its military was better organized than Iraq's. Its air force and navy were absolutely superior than Iraq's, and they were able to dominate the skies and the seas. But as time went on, the equipment that it had, which was produced by the West and purchased by the Shah, broke down, was lost or destroyed. Without a competent homegrown war industry or arms industry, the Iranian armed forces found themselves more and more stripped of the ability to conduct combined arms warfare, and more were dependent upon light infantry without artillery support, air support, or armored support. By 1982, Iraq offered white peace, and the war would have been essentially won with Iranian territory going back into Iranian hands. Any real invasion of Iraq wasn't really necessary for them, as it would be costly for Iran, who by that time even had exhausted its equipment stockpiles. So why then should we ask, did Iran pursue regime change for the next 6 years despite no substantial gains? The answer was that despite the high casualties, the war paid real dividends for the Iranian leadership. The Islamic Republic's leadership, instead of depending upon a trained officer corps, which it depended on at the beginning of the war, they saw this officer corps as unloyal to the regime. Instead, they turned to the explicitly Khomeiniist Islamic Revolutionary Guard, which used human wave tactics against Iraqi positions and often used lightly trained teenage soldiers. And this is what they preferred rather than a armed and competent modern military which had existed under the Shah beforehand and which continued into the beginning of the Khomeiniist era during the chaos of revolution. The Islamic Guard, Revolutionary Guard that is, would incur heavy casualties and show little for it, but they were much more loyal to the regime, and the blood of the martyrs and the theater surrounding that would inspire a cult of loyalty to the Ayatollah, which exists to this day. The conventional army, by contrast, saw its prestige plummet, as both its leader, with both the leadership of Iran and its standing within the general Iranian society. The Islamist leadership was not just able to cement its leadership with the Republican Guard, but it was able to use the stress of the war to outmaneuver its opponents at home. Khomeini was able to expertly outmaneuver the first Iranian president, Abolhassan Banstir. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce it very well. Anyway, he forced his impeachment and exile in June of 1981. The Khomeinists were then able to flex their authority to take control of the revolution, and then they were able to create a new and very malleable constitution. The liberals, the leftists, and the Islamic socialists had already begun in a weaker revolution than the Khomeinists, but with the war going on and the stress that it placed on Iranian society, they were not able to really eke out any true power within Iran's newly created and extremely Byzantine constitution. So then, Khomeini allies would greatly cement their power over the course of the war. Saddam executed generals during the war when they failed. Saddam had already deeply politicized his own military prior to this war. something that is seen as often essential in the Arab world due to the endemic nature of coups within the region. The Baathists had gained power in a coup themselves, then lost power in a coup, and then regained power in a coup. Early in Saddam's official presidency, he had purged the Ba'ath Party on July 22nd, killing and exiling opponents he charged to be a fifth column allied with the Syrian faction of the Ba'athist Party. The war then occurred only a few months later, after Saddam had only recently taken de jure control of the country. And the war helped him cement himself in his power as well. All wars which he engaged in, despite the destruction they brought upon Iraq, only caused the populace to depend upon him more and his clique more and more as time went on. While the Iranian military was starved for supplies and had to increasingly depend upon light infantry as the war went on, Iraq did not face the same problems. Iraq had support of the West, the Arab world, and the Soviet bloc. Iran had angered the entire world and became an international pariah for its hostage-taking, its support of Hezbollah during the Lebanese civil war, and its support for global Islamist revolution. While some nations played both sides during the war, the amount of aid and support that Iraq received dwarfed that of the Iranians. I think that in the historiography, the playing of both sides has been greatly exaggerated because it just kind of is interesting. It promotes popular interest because of its hypocrisy. But the reality is that the support that Iraq garnered internationally is far and away dwarfs that of Iran. For an example, with America, the actual amounts of arms that was sold to Iran is very small. It was limited to a few thousand Tau missiles to Iran, which was just traded for hostages. When the Iran-Contra scandal that we're talking about broke in the United States, it almost ended Iraqi's intelligence alliance with the United States, despite Iraq's extreme dependence upon American intelligence. That scandal, though, contributed to the conspiracy widely held within the Ba'athist and Arab circles of Iraq of this grand Israeli-Iranian conspiracy against Iraq, which is absolutely retarded, but whatever. America and its foreign policy establishment saw the war as very important and very threatening to international security. So they were deeply incensed. They were personally upset and deeply incensed by Iran for its hostage crisis taking of hostages and the bombing of the Marine bunker in Lebanon in 1983 by what they saw as a vassal of Iran, Hezbollah. As such, it would support Iraq heavily throughout the war. The United States intelligence gathering on behalf of Iraq, especially sharing satellite data of Iranian positions, was a crucial boon to Iraq's war effort. The satellite data allowed Iraqis to know of every Iranian offensive ahead of time and prepare accordingly. Such intelligence rendered Iran at a severe disadvantage, especially in a war defined by static warfare and a near indefinite stalemate, which prevented it from really ever using its superior manpower to gain the initiative. And it was also America's intervention in the tanker war in 1987 and 1988, and Operation Earnest Will, which would prove crucial to ending the war. The United States had pledged to prevent any power from restricting or preventing the flow out of the Persian Gulf, and both Iran and Iraq were doing so during this tanker war. So the United States deployed its navy in the Gulf to protect shipping out of the oil out of the region. The United States had already proved massive support for Iraq by sharing its intelligence, but its role during the tanker war would be much greater in importance. When Iraqi aircraft attacked an American frigate with Exocet missiles on May 17, 1987, in the Stark incident, which resulted in 37 seamen dying on the United States' side, the United States accepted Iraq's apology and did not retaliate by attacking the Iraqis. When an American missile frigate struck a mine in international waters, which was set by Iran on the other hand, The United States retaliated 4 days later on April 18th, 1988, by destroying almost the entire Iranian army in Operation Praying Mantis. The United States also destroyed 2 Iranian oil platforms in retaliation for an Iranian attack on a Kuwaiti transport ship in 1987. On July 3rd, American forces shot down I think this is 1988, July 3rd. American forces shot down Iranian Air Flight 655, killing 290. While the United States claimed or considered this an accident, Iran considered it a deliberate attack upon the Iranian civilians. To this day, the United States has never issued a formal apology to Iran or admitted its fault in attacking the civilian airliner, despite paying amnesties to Iran. These actions by the United States deeply influenced the Iranian leadership to pursue peace, calculating that the United States was moving towards full-scale war on the Iraqi side against Iran. By 1988, the Iranian armed forces were depleted of equipment and had suffered massive casualties. They now had very low morale. Iraq had prepared its troops for a massive offensive by extensively training them to take back territory which Iran had taken. Iraq's total armed forces now actually outnumbered Iran's total armed forces. Iraq had at least a 4-to-1 advantage, if not higher, in artillery pieces, armored vehicles, fixed-wing aircraft, and helicopters. Iraq would send its troops in highly coordinated offensives, commanded carefully through inflexible, scripted actions that mimic combined warfares of the West and Israel. It wasn't really capable of doing any kind of combined warfare outside of this tight script. And so its advantages, though, in equipment and its willingness to use massive amounts of chemical weapons, put to defending Iranian light infantry at a great disadvantage. On April 17th and 18th, during the Second Battle of Al-Fa, Iraq was able to push Iran out of the Al-Fa Peninsula and unlandlock itself. Iraq then launched another series of attacks known as, I'm going to mispronounce this, Tukanwana Allah operations from the end of April to July 1988. These highly scripted attacks were able to push the Iranians out of Iraqi territory overall, and they pushed into Iranian border regions. Saddam, aware of just how long this war lasted and the extent of puppeting needed to actually have this type of combined arms warfare on the Iraqi side, kind of became a realist, and he wasn't greedy anymore, and he sought a white peace immediately, and he did not want to push his luck again. Iran, now exhausted and fearful of a full-scale war with the United States, accepted the white peace. So after nearly 8 years of brutal warfare and hundreds of thousands of deaths, nothing had been achieved materially by either side, and the border had not budged in any real direction, leaving a white peace, right? Anyway, neither side had really been able to enact regime change, and instead the opposite happened. Each side's authoritarian and bizarre kind of like internal native regime became very stable. Both sides claimed victory. Iran had defended the Islamic Revolution and gathered the whole Iranian nation, both Persian and minority, under a patriotic radical banner, which unified the country, and the Islamic Republic continues to this day. Iraq had defended the dignity of both the Arab civilization from its hated Persian enemy, and it conversely righted the wrongs of Persia's ancient conquest of Babylon. And now Iraq, modern Iraq under Saddam, could be an heir of this Babylonian legacy. They pushed back the Persian invader, which had conquered the original Babylon back, I think, 6th or 7th century BC. And now Iraq was fully sovereign from its Persian enemies once again.